Thank you very much, Professor Lipke, for the introduction. Indeed, I was asked by the organizers to deliver something on the traces of conversion of Norway in more or less contemporary skaldic poetry. So this is the topic of my presentation, with some short reference to not only 11th but also 12th century. The conversion of Norway is traditionally bound with the two so-called missionary kings of Norway, two Olafs, Olaf Tryggvason and then Olaf Haraldsson. And both are said to convert personally outside Scandinavia. The first Olaf in England, as the conclusion of his raiding activity in mid-1990s, when he met with Ethelred II and decided to be baptized. And Olaf Haraldsson, who probably was baptized in Normandy in early 11th century, and both rulers are said to be those who decided to use Christian ideology, Christian doctrine to support their attempts to gain power in Norway and then also strengthen their positions as kings. So traditionally we associate them with the first initiatives of both building up the first churches, for example in Nidaros, and also in the case of Olaf Haraldsson, the tradition of introduction of the first so-called Christian law, the law was based on or supported by the Christian doctrine. The activity that made them really famous dominates the depiction in later local tradition, represented by saga corpus, where both kings are said to be very uncompromising in their missionary efforts, and this very dedicated approach is depicted as the reason of their temporary falls. Both kings had to face opposition, who is
after Zbyżyce,
maybe not only neglected the royalty of both kings, but also
after
at the same time
Zbyżyce, we have coming next Wolińskie, but unsuccessfully for the first time. Next Szczecin,
and again also depicted as the ones who, especially in the early stages of the reign, were quite reluctant to accept skulls in their retinue. It is not expressed explicitly directly why, but we can deduce that it was because those kings found the poetry as extremely tied to the pagan imagery, pagan beliefs. That's why they were reluctant to accept the new poets in the retinues. Contrary to this kind of uniform depiction, the same saga corpus preserves not only a poetry of poets, of skalds that are associated with both rulers. It is also shown that actually their relation to poets was used to also underline the character and also effectiveness of their missionary efforts. And of course, Sagat corpus preserves a memory of numerous poets who were said to be associated with both kings. I would like to focus on two of them. Halfred Oddarsson, who is remembered in sagas as the main, the most trusted, the most important poet of Olaf Tryggvason, and Sigvard Oddarsson, who played approximately the same or even more advanced role at the court of Olaf Haraldsson, Olaf the Saint. I will also refer to two other poets who were associated with, if not with two Olafs directly, but also with something that we call emergence of the cult of Saint Olaf. These poems provided by these two poets can be divided into two main groups. The first group, they're the compositions that we traditionally date to the times where both kings were still reigning, were still alive. And the poetry that was composed after the fall of those kings, and is a character of memorial poems dedicated to their time, their life, and also the circumstances of their deaths. And this division also is important in trying and attempting to find traces of their missionary efforts within the context of those compositions. What is important, this poetic legacy can be considered not only as a key to study how those two monarchs more or less effectively try to convert their kingdom, but also those compositions themselves are evidence of certain important influence of new religion on this very art, which is also important in itself, especially if we remember that late 10th, early 11th century is the time of supposed kind of crisis in skaldic composition, when poets were confronted by new expectations from the rulers who were willing to rely their power on Christian doctrine. So these poets kind of seem to be good examples of how these expectations were actually faced by especially those who were also treated as a kind of poetic innovators when it comes to skaldic poetry of that period. So I will jump from examples to and show up kind of experts of these compositions in order to focus on elements that could be considered as traces of this missionary character of these two reigns of those two Olafs, or at least Christian profile of those both kings. At least chronologically, we would start with Olaf's Draupad, a poem about Olafur, dedicated to Olaf Tryggvason, that is supposedly composed at the time when Olaf is just about to take power in Norway, so some circa 995. This poem, or the stanzas that are preserved, focus on king's activities as a Viking leader. So he travels around certain parts of Europe, including Baltic, England, and so forth, and proves his military prowess as an effective Viking who provides destruction, fear, and so forth to those who are attacked. In this case, there are people of probably Jutland and some Wends who are targets of Olaf's activity. At the same time, the poet seems to implement elements that seem to reveal probably the most important intention of the composition, which is not a report of what Olaf did as Viking leader, rather how this Viking activity presents Olaf as an effective king, ruler over certain people. So all those targets are supposed, or representatives of supposed subjects who, in this case, the poor people of Jutland and some Wends, were bad enough to kind of rebel against the king. King is shown as effective in eliminating rebels and providing the right rule. And in this case, the poet decides to depict the king as the shrine destroyer, or somebody who is against hidden temples. And we can deduce that it is a reference to Norwegian situation, especially if we compare this very stanza with later account of Adam of Bremen about Olaf Tryggvason, who also emphasizes this king's will and energy to expel all these pagan sorcerers from the country. However, taking the poem as a whole, we could also say that these pagan shrines could exist anywhere else, but the ability and energy and dedication of the king to destroy them is supposed to be a proof of his energy and effectiveness in being just a monarch, a ruler. Alfred is especially known for his very extended, approximate circa 30 stanzas poem that is a memorial composition composed shortly after Olaf's death in the year 1000. Here we learn, among the other things, that the poem as a whole is mainly focused on the battle in Öresund, where King Olaf died. And here the poet decides to include some personal reference to the king who is not dead, whose death could be perceived as a sign of his sanctity, as his godfather, the one who actually was responsible for his own personal baptism. And this reference is very intriguing, especially if we compare Olaf's Drapa, Öffi-Drapa, which is this memorial poem of Olaf, with the set of other stanzas that are attributed to Alfred Ottarson, so-called convention stanzas, where the poet, by saga tradition, forced by the king, reluctantly, but finally, effectively, dedicates himself to Christ, which is not an easy thing for him. Anyway, he not only shows that there was a king who forced him to pray to Christ, but also it is also the reference to this energetic, fierceful, uncompromising will to destroy all of these remnants of pagan law among the Norwegians. However, probably the thing that seems to be dominant in this depiction, the poetic depiction of Olaf of Tryggvason, that could be associated somehow with his Christian profile, is this tendency to be the one who is not active converter, but he presents Christian profile as his personal charisma. This is his ability to be dedicated to the faith. So it looks like the king is supposed to be an example himself, and his approach is something that presumably should be followed, rather than emphasis on his active, forceful perhaps, as saga claim, attempts to make other baptized, except for the poet himself. So the king is a devoted Christian, rather than whose Christianity is focused on himself, and the emphasis on his and this will to make his subject Christian is not so much underlined in the poetry of Alfred Ottarson, who, it is important, kind of represents the milieu of people who simply decided to follow Olaf, and perhaps one of the conditions of being close to the king was acceptance of the new faith. When we turn to the king who definitely overshadowed Olaf Tryggvason as the missionary king, Olaf the Saint, we surprisingly face similar trends. Again, poetry composed during the life of the King Olaf seem to kind of ignore this tradition developed later on, that the new monarch started and ended his reign with uncompromising promotion of new faith. Rather, these references are kind of not direct, so to speak. If we take Sigvardur Thordarson, one of his earlier poems, the poem about his journey to the east, presumably Sweden, he was supposed to meet Jarl Ragnvald of Västergötland. The poet himself focuses in most of the stanzas, on his troubles in a way, and these troubles that are to excuse his potential lack of success in his mission. include confrontation with pagans who are nice enough to suggest Zygmunt that he should actually go away. Otherwise, he will face serious problems. So he does it. So it's like that we can deduce that it is to distinguish them, those pagans, those heathen, from us, the king, me as his representative, and his written or supposed Christian. So it's kind of like indirect reference to king as a Christian ruler and his retinue as those who share the faith of the ruler. Then we can refer to the poem that probably played exactly the same role as Halfet's Olav's Draupa. The poem that probably began Zygmunt's career at St. Olaf's court, called Vikingarvisur, the verses of the Viking activity, of the Vikings. And similarly to Olaf Tryggvason, the poem focuses on Olafur as a Viking leader. And again, those who are the targets of this activity are depicted as those who, in other circumstances perhaps, would be his subjects, who again have a specific, rather negative role to play. They provide treachery, and they are rebels, so they deserve the punishment. A king is shown as the effective ruler by being able to punish all signs of treachery, rebellion against him. So it's kind of like a warning. Beware. The king has already proven he's able to eliminate his enemies that way. If we are about to associate this concept of just king, and just meaning the providing a law, but also execution of law, that could be this kind of indirect reference, perhaps very important at that time, to his Christian profile, again, ignoring potential energy in promoting Christianity that way or another. Then we have a stanza that comes from another poet, Otasvati, who made his career in Scandinavia and beyond, also in England. And the poem that has traditional name Hofut Lans, which is the head ransom, probably should be called actually the poem about Olafur, also reflects on Viking activity by King Olafur. And again, we have, this composition is generally said to be kind of based on Zygmunt's compositions. Both poets were related, so it's a kind of big chance that one kind of taught the other how and what to provide in order to please the king. And what we have here is again the usage of the Viking pillaging motive to actually supplement the profile of the king who is able to rule according to the law that he provides, and those who are against the king will suffer this fire, this smoke that is a kind of visual depiction of all this misery that is addressed to those who are ready to oppose the king. And again, we have the same reference in already mentioned Ástvararvísur by Sigvardur Þórðarson. That's quite a common motive of a king being enemy of thieves, those who break the law provided by a ruler. We can only deduce, again, referring this content of the poems to the latest Saga tradition, that this is already the Christian law that places the king as the main provider of peace and tranquility by eliminating all those who stir up the order provided by the king. However, and this is again the same situation. So king punishes those who oppose his rule, oppose the law he provides. and depiction of those people as evildoers, thieves, rebels, then also sinners, is quite frequent, and we can see that with time it only develops. This is already provided by in the poem that is composed after Saint Olaf death, because the memorial poem about this Olaf, the saint, composed by Sigvatur, was composed already when Norway was ruled by his son Magnus the Good. Sigvatur, of course, is very full of praise towards him, who fall at Stiklestadir. But strangely enough, any references to his missionary activities are kind of taken aside. The main focus is on his provision of just rules, just reign, and reading this, probably, presently, the recipients of this poem had to have this impression that well, that was a time of reference, so anyone who is going to rule afterwards should actually refer to this time and this ruler who kind of created and provided a new standard, and we can only deduce this new standard and also a kind of supplement of the Christian doctrine. On the other hand, there are some very tiny references to Christian profile of the rule of Saint Olaf in this poetry. Again, Ottar Svarti, who directs one of the victories that Olafur gained during his Viking career, that it was actually provided by God himself. So we're kind of like, we step back in time to his career as a Viking before he became a king, before became potentially and supposedly very active Christian missionary king, but already we see that it is all authorized by the right higher power, which is the God himself. And probably the only one kind of direct reference to King Saint Olaf as the one who changes religious situation, or wants to change, aims at change the religious situation in Norway. It is again this memorial poem when we learn that King established Christianity in Norway, and it's a kind of addition to us all very distinguished profile of a monarch who is already dead, but still should be treated as an example to follow. We learn a little bit more after Olaf's death, and one of the most intriguing examples is the poem that was composed in completely different circumstances but at the time, and it was when, after Olaf's death, Knut the Great decided to send his son Svein to Norway, accompanied by several people, including his mother, Edith of Northampton. And saga tradition uses this story about this Danish temporary regime in Norway to use it as a proof that only Norwegians, contrary to Danes, were ready to recognize what was obvious, which is the sanctity of the fallen king. But we are provided with the poem that shows completely different story, which is probably an attempt of the Danish regime to either promote or at least take control over freshly developing cult, where Svein Knudsen is shown as the one who is supposed to treat Olaf as his predecessor. He should visit his shrine to pray and ask him for support in God's grace. And Olafur is depicted as the one who obtained the prosperity and peace among the people, and perhaps, as a speculation, you can see that could potentially be the content of this missionary activities. The king is the king that justifies his attempts in order to explain that this is the only right way to deliver what he is expected to deliver. This unquestioned, undisputed values, which is of course the prosperity and peace. And later saga authors also will use this motive to show that the time of Svein Knudsen was in fact complete opposition of this ideal provided by Olaf. So there was famine in the country, there was chaos in the country, and everything changed once people truly dedicated themselves to the memory of Olaf as a truly saintly monarch. However, this very poem shows that there were some attempts by Danes controlling Norway at the time to use this very cult. And then, of course, Magnus the Good, and the poetry dedicated to Magnus is vast enough. So I just only decided to use one piece, again provided by Sigvard Thordarson, where again we have the reference not to king as a promoter of Christianity as such, but first of all as the one who provides a law, as a good law, and the king is depicted as the one, actually both Olafs in fact, who were able to effectively execute this right law. So this is the main criteria, not the religion as such. We can presumably think that, well, those things were kind of attached to each other, but the emphasis is on the legal activity of both kings, the activity that Magnus the Good, Kund Hilmis, which is the relative kinsman of the king, the Saint Olaf, should actually follow totally. And then short reference to 12th century. It is important already. Okay, I'm just finished. That's all. The references to crusading ideology provided by both Professor Supecki and Professor Rosik, I think it is also important in this context. In 12th century, situation changes a little bit. Poems on Olaf Tryggvason focus on his Christian or missionary successes outside Norway. For the first time, we learn which countries he embraced by his activity. When it comes to Saint Olaf, the main 12th century sources, of course, Einar Sturlason's Geistly, composed at the time of the foundation of Archbishopric of Nidaros. And here again, strangely enough, Saint Olaf, undisputably saintly king, is again shown as an example to follow in a rather passive way. So the recipients of the poem probably, again, should see him as a good Christian monarch, and it should be enough. We don't need him to be an energetic and effective missionary king who forces somebody. We don't, hearing this poem, we shouldn't be forced anymore. We should follow this example willingly, and referring to this crusading ideology, it's worth mentioning that Einar several times in this very long poem calls Olaf as Guds Riddare, the God's knight. So, kind of conclusions. Of course, it's not a point to question both Olafs as the ones who were important in the process of conversion of Norway. However, interesting observation is that the poems were in the retinues, even if they are interested in sending out this idea of a king who is of a new kind, a Christian monarch, decided to focus on directly and more visibly on different things. A situation changes definitely when both kings are dead, and it is important to either keep the memory when it comes to Olaf Tryggvason, and also in order to promote sanctity of the Olaf Haraldsson. Then we see stronger emphasis on this Christian element of the reign, and of course, both in the poems and later saga tradition, we can see that conversion and acceptance of the new faith, or this is missionary activity, is mainly defined as an example of building up the connections between the king and the subject. So being religious means being faithful, which is absolutely not surprising. This is the main emphasis that both the poets and then later saga authors try to underline. Thank you very much for your attention.